The macabre history of the Harrisons. A millionaire left 8 orphans, without a trace of money in the affluent hills of Greenwich, Connecticut, where manicured lawns stretched endlessly and old money whispered through generations. The Harrison estate stood as a monument to American prosperity. The year was 1978, and the sprawling Georgian mansion with its white columns and perfectly symmetrical windows had been home to the Harrison family for over 3 decades, a symbol of wealth, refinement, and social standing that few could rival. Charles Harrison had built his fortune during the post-war boom of the 1950s, transforming a modest inheritance into a multi-million-dollar empire through shrewd investments in real estate, manufacturing, and emerging technologies. By the 1970s, he was considered one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut, his business acumen legendary among his peers, and his lifestyle the envy of high society throughout the Northeast. The Harrison mansion itself was a testament to Charles's success and taste. 42 rooms spread across 15,000 square feet of living space, filled with priceless antiques, original artwork, and furnishings that had been carefully selected from the finest sources around the world. The grounds encompass 27 acres of professionally landscaped gardens, complete with tennis courts, a swimming pool, and stables that housed a collection of prize-winning thoroughbred horses. Charles Harrison was a man who commanded respect through both his wealth and his imposing presence. At 64 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through anyone who attempted to deceive him. His business dealings were conducted with ruthless efficiency, and his personal life was managed with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him successful in the corporate world. The Harrison children had grown up surrounded by luxury that most people could only imagine. 8 children in total, ranging in age from 12 to 26. They had attended the finest private schools, traveled extensively throughout Europe and Asia, and had been groomed from birth to take their places among America's elite social circles. Margaret, the eldest at 26, had graduated from Vassar with a degree in art history and had spent the past several years managing charitable foundations on behalf of the family. James, 24, had completed his MBA at Harvard and was being prepared to eventually take over the family's business interests. The younger children, Catherine, Robert, Elizabeth, Thomas, Susan, and young Michael, were all excelling in their respective educational pursuits and social activities. The family's social calendar was a constant succession of charity galas, country club events, and exclusive gatherings that reinforced their position at the pinnacle of Connecticut society. Charles Harrison served on the boards of several major corporations and cultural institutions, while his late wife Martha's memory was honored through the numerous philanthropic organizations she had established before her death from cancer in 1974. However, beneath the polished surface of Harrison family life, there were undercurrents of tension and mystery that few outsiders ever glimpsed. Charles had become increasingly reclusive in recent years, spending long hours in his private study, conducting business meetings behind closed doors, and displaying a level of paranoia that seemed inconsistent with his previous confident demeanor. The staff at the Harrison estate, a team of 12 full-time employees, including housekeepers, groundskeepers, and personal assistants, had begun to notice changes in their employer's behavior. Charles had started working late into the night, making frequent mysterious phone calls, and receiving visitors who arrived and departed at unusual hours. His normally immaculate appearance had become slightly disheveled, and his legendary composure occasionally cracked under pressures that remained invisible to his family and employees. The children had also observed their father's increasing isolation and strange behavior, but their attempts to understand what was troubling him were met with evasive responses and firm instructions to focus on their own lives and responsibilities. Charles had always been a private man who kept his business affairs separate from family life, so his reluctance to discuss his concerns seemed merely an extension of his usual approach to family management. What none of the Harrison children knew was that their father's empire was built on foundations far more unstable than anyone could have imagined. Behind the facade of legitimate business success lay a complex web of questionable investments, hidden partnerships, and financial arrangements that existed in the gray areas between legal business practices and outright fraud. Charles Harrison's rise to wealth had not been achieved solely through the brilliant investment strategies that he claimed in public. A significant portion of his fortune had been generated through his involvement with organized crime figures who had used his legitimate businesses to launder money, hide assets, and conduct transactions that would have been impossible through conventional financial channels. The relationships that Charles had cultivated with these dangerous partners had provided him with access to capital and opportunities that legitimate businessmen could never have obtained. However, they had also created obligations and debts that could not be satisfied through conventional means. The loyalty that Charles had purchased with his services was conditional and temporary, and the interest rates on his borrowed capital were calculated in terms far more dangerous than money. By 1978, the complex financial structure that supported the Harrison fortune was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Federal investigations into organized crime activities had begun to focus on the legitimate businesses that had been used for money laundering, and Charles's name was appearing with increasing frequency in confidential law enforcement files. Pressure from both law enforcement and his criminal associates had been building steadily throughout 1977 and early 1978. Charles found himself caught between investigators who were closing in on his illegal activities and partners who were demanding services that would expose him to even greater legal jeopardy. His attempts to extricate himself from these dangerous relationships only served to increase the suspicions of both sides. The children's first indication that something was seriously wrong came on the morning of September 15, 1978, when Charles Harrison was found dead in his study by the head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson. The 64-year-old patriarch was discovered slumped over his desk, apparently having died during the night while working on business documents that were scattered across the room. The official cause of death was determined to be a heart attack, a conclusion that seemed plausible given Charles's age, the stress he had been under, and his family history of cardiovascular disease. However, the circumstances surrounding his death raised questions that would haunt the Harrison family for years to come. The scene in Charles's study suggested that he had been engaged in frantic activity during his final hours. Documents were strewn across the floor, filing cabinets had been left open, and there were signs that someone had been searching through papers and records with desperate urgency. Several pieces of furniture showed evidence of having been moved, and a safe hidden behind a painting had been left open and apparently emptied. More disturbing still was the discovery that Charles had destroyed a substantial number of documents in the fireplace during his final night. The ashes contained fragments of financial records, correspondence, and what appeared to be legal documents that might have provided crucial information about his business dealings and personal affairs. The Harrison family's tragedy deepened significantly when Charles's will was read 3 days after his funeral. The document, which had been updated just 6 months before his death, contained provisions that shocked everyone who knew the family's circumstances. Despite the obvious wealth that surrounded them, Charles Harrison had left his 8 children virtually nothing. The will revealed that the Harrison estate was encumbered by massive debts that far exceeded the value of all family assets. The mansion, the artwork, the horses, and even the family's personal possessions had been pledged as collateral for loans that totaled more than $15 million. After settling these debts, the Harrison children would be left with less than $50,000 to divide among themselves. The family's attorney, Franklin Morse, who had served the Harrisons for over 20 years, was as stunned by these revelations as the children themselves. His examination of Charles's financial records revealed a pattern of increasingly desperate borrowing that had accelerated dramatically during the previous 2 years. Properties had been mortgaged and remortgaged, business assets had been sold at below market prices, and substantial cash withdrawals had been made from accounts that were now empty. The creditors who began arriving at the Harrison estate within days of Charles's death were not the typical financial institutions that the family might have expected. Instead, they represented shadowy organizations and individuals whose very presence suggested that the family patriarch had been involved in business relationships that existed far outside the boundaries of legitimate commerce. The children's attempts to understand their father's financial dealings were hampered by the deliberate destruction of records and the unwillingness of many of his business associates to discuss their relationships with the deceased patriarch. Those who were willing to talk provided fragments of information that painted a picture of a man who had been trapped in increasingly dangerous financial arrangements that had spiraled beyond his control. Margaret Harrison, as the eldest child, and the family member with the most business education, took the lead in trying to unravel the mystery of their father's debts and obligations. Her investigation revealed that Charles had been involved in a complex network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and financial arrangements that seemed designed to conceal the true nature of his business activities. The Harrison children faced not only the loss of their wealth and social position, but also the growing realization that their father's death might not have been the natural heart attack that it appeared to be. The timing of his death, coinciding with what appeared to be desperate attempts to resolve his financial problems, suggested that Charles Harrison might have been murdered by associates who had grown tired of waiting for payment of debts that could never be satisfied through legitimate means. As the family struggled to understand their transformed circumstances, they began to discover that their father's legacy included not only financial debts, but also obligations to dangerous people who would not simply disappear because the debtor had died. The Harrison children were about to learn that some debts are inherited regardless of what any legal document might specify, and that their father's sins would cast shadows over their lives for years to come. The magnificent estate that had been their home would soon be sold to satisfy creditors. The possessions that had defined their social status would be auctioned to the highest bidders, and the 8 Harrison children would be forced to make their way in a world for which their privileged upbringing had left them completely unprepared. The forced sale of the Harrison estate in November 1978 marked the beginning of the family's descent into a world they had never imagined they would inhabit. The auction of their possessions drew curious onlookers from throughout Connecticut's high society, former friends and acquaintances who came to witness the spectacular fall of one of the region's most prominent families. Margaret Harrison watched from the mansion's front steps as strangers carried away the artwork, furniture, and personal items that had filled her childhood with beauty and security. The proceeds from the sale would barely cover half of the debts that her father had accumulated, leaving the family not only homeless but still owing substantial sums to creditors, whose patience was rapidly diminishing. The 8 Harrison children were forced to separate for the first time in their lives, each finding temporary shelter with distant relatives or family friends who were willing to help but could not accommodate the entire family together. This dispersion made it difficult for them to coordinate their efforts to understand what had happened to their father and why he had left them in such desperate circumstances. Margaret's investigation into her father's business dealings led her to a small office in New York City that served as the headquarters for several of the companies listed in Charles's incomplete financial records. The address led to a dingy building in Lower Manhattan, far removed from the prestigious business districts where legitimate financial operations were typically conducted. The office was managed by Vincent Torino, a man whose expensive clothing and careful mannerisms could not entirely conceal his connections to the criminal underworld that operated in the shadows of legitimate business. Torino was reluctant to discuss his relationship with Charles Harrison, But Margaret's persistence and her obvious desperation eventually convinced him to reveal some of the circumstances that had led to her father's downfall. Charles Harrison's involvement with organized crime had begun innocently enough during the early 1960s, when he had been approached by associates of the Torino family to provide legitimate business fronts for certain financial transactions. The arrangement had been presented as a temporary solution to regulatory problems that were hampering legitimate business activities, and the compensation offered had been too attractive to refuse. Over the years, Charles's role in these arrangements had expanded gradually as his success in legitimate business made him an increasingly valuable partner for money laundering and asset concealment activities. The profits from these services had provided much of the capital that funded his expansion into real estate and manufacturing, creating a cycle of dependence that became impossible to break. The relationship had remained profitable and relatively safe for Charles throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, when law enforcement attention to organized crime activities was less sophisticated and intensive. However, the federal government's increasing focus on financial crimes during the mid-1970s had created new risks that neither Charles nor his criminal associates had fully anticipated. Federal investigations had begun to identify the patterns of financial transactions that indicated money laundering activities, and several of the businesses that Charles had been using for these purposes had come under scrutiny. The pressure from law enforcement had forced him to find new methods for concealing illegal funds, methods that required him to take greater personal risks and assume larger financial obligations. Margaret's investigation revealed that her father had been borrowing money from his criminal associates to maintain the appearance of legitimate business success, while actually using the funds to pay previous debts and cover the costs of increasingly elaborate concealment schemes. The interest rates on these loans were far higher than anything available through legitimate financial institutions, and the consequences of default were not limited to financial penalties. Vincent Torino's explanation of Charles Harrison's situation painted a picture of a man who had become trapped in a cycle of debt and obligation that could only have ended in disaster. The federal investigations had made it impossible for Charles to continue providing the services that his criminal associates required, while simultaneously making it impossible for him to cease these activities without exposing himself to prosecution. The pressure from both sides had intensified throughout 1977 and early 1978, as federal agents had begun asking questions about Charles's business activities, while his criminal associates had demanded larger payments and more dangerous services. His attempts to satisfy both groups had required him to leverage every asset he possessed, ultimately mortgaging the family's entire fortune to raise the funds necessary to avoid immediate disaster. Margaret learned that her father's death had not been entirely unexpected by his criminal associates, who had been aware of his deteriorating health and increasing desperation. However, his death had not resolved the debts he owed, and his associates expected these obligations to be satisfied by his estate or, if necessary, by his family members. The revelation that the Harrison children were still considered responsible for their father's debts to organized crime figures came as a devastating shock to Margaret and her siblings. They had assumed that their father's death would at least free them from the obligations that had destroyed his life, but they were learning that criminal debts operated according to different rules than legitimate financial arrangements. James Harrison, the second oldest child and the one with the most business education, attempted to negotiate with the criminal figures who were demanding payment of his father's debts. His meetings with these dangerous individuals took place in restaurants and social clubs throughout New York City, where he was forced to listen to explanations of why his family remained responsible for obligations they had never incurred. Criminal organization that had been Charles Harrison's primary business partner was led by Anthony Torino, Vincent's older brother and a man whose reputation for violence had been established over decades of involvement in illegal activities. Anthony made it clear that the Harrison family's debts would be satisfied one way or another, and that the children's ignorance of their father's activities would not excuse them from meeting their inherited obligations. The amount owed by the Harrison family was substantial enough that simply earning the money through legitimate employment would take decades, even if all 8 children devoted their entire incomes to debt repayment. More troubling still was the indication that the criminal organization was not particularly interested in monetary repayment, preferring instead to use the family's debt as leverage to secure their cooperation in new illegal activities. The pressure applied to the Harrison children took various forms, designed to demonstrate the organization's reach and willingness to use violence to achieve their objectives. James Harrison was beaten by unknown assailants while walking to his temporary job at a small accounting firm. Catherine Harrison discovered that her apartment had been ransacked while she was at work, with nothing stolen but everything searched and disarranged as a warning. Margaret Harrison realized that her family's only hope for survival lay in finding evidence that could expose the criminal organization's activities to law enforcement, potentially providing the leverage necessary to negotiate their freedom from inherited debts. Her search for this evidence led her back to the ruins of the family estate, where she believed her father might have hidden documents that could prove crucial to their survival. The Harrison mansion had been purchased by a developer who planned to demolish the building and subdivide the property for new construction. However, Margaret's familiarity with the house allowed her to search areas that new owners might overlook, including hidden compartments and secret spaces that her father had installed during renovations over the years. That her search was successful beyond her wildest hopes. Hidden behind a false wall in the mansion's basement, Margaret discovered a substantial collection of documents that Charles had preserved as insurance against his criminal associates. The papers included detailed records of money laundering transactions, correspondence with organized crime figures, and evidence of corruption involving public officials who had been paid to ignore criminal activities. The documents also revealed the full extent of Charles Harrison's involvement in criminal activities, showing that his role had been far more significant than even his children had suspected. He had not simply provided business fronts for money laundering, but had actively participated in planning and executing sophisticated financial crimes that had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Most importantly, the documents contained evidence that Charles Harrison's death had not been caused by a natural heart attack. Medical records hidden with the other papers showed that Charles had been receiving treatment for a heart condition, but that his medication had been tampered with in ways that would have caused the cardiac episode that killed him. The evidence suggested that Charles had been murdered by his criminal associates when they realized that his continued survival posed too great a risk to their organization. His knowledge of their activities, combined with the pressure he was under from federal investigators, had made him a liability that could no longer be tolerated. Margaret Harrison's discovery of this evidence provided her family with the leverage they needed to negotiate their freedom from the criminal organization that had been demanding payment of their father's debts. The documents contained enough incriminating information to send numerous organized crime figures to prison for extended periods, making them extremely valuable as bargaining chips. The negotiation process was dangerous and complex, requiring the Harrison children to work with federal law enforcement agents while simultaneously avoiding actions that might provoke violent retaliation from the criminal organization. The FBI had been investigating the Torino family for several years, and the Harrison documents provided the evidence necessary to build cases that would effectively destroy the organization. The resolution of the Harrison family's crisis came through a carefully orchestrated operation that resulted in the arrest of Anthony and Vincent Torino, along with dozens of other criminal associates who had been involved in the money laundering operation. The evidence provided by the Harrison documents led to convictions that eliminated the family's debt obligations while also ensuring that they would no longer be targeted for retaliation. The Harrison children's emergence from their ordeal was marked by both relief and profound transformation. They had lost their wealth, their social position, and their naive faith in their father's integrity. But they had gained a deeper understanding of their own resilience and the importance of family bonds that transcended material circumstances. Margaret Harrison used her experience to build a career in financial investigation, helping law enforcement agencies understand the complex schemes used by organized crime to conceal illegal profits. James Harrison became a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, while the younger children rebuilt their lives with a clearer understanding of the difference between genuine success and the hollow facade that their father had maintained. Macabre history of the Harrison family serves as a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of wealth that is built on compromised foundations, and the ways in which family members can become unwitting victims of choices made by those they trust. The 8 Harrison children learned that true security cannot be purchased with money that comes from questionable sources, and that the most valuable inheritance they could receive was the strength to rebuild their lives according to their own values and principles. The Harrison estate was eventually demolished and replaced with a subdivision of modest homes, but the lessons learned from the family's tragedy continued to influence law enforcement approaches to organized crime and the protection of family members who inherit the consequences of criminal activities they never chose to participate in or support. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,